Thank you so much for joining us on this Friday afternoon. My name is Anna, and I'll just deliver some words of welcome to get us started. We're very appreciative, very thankful to Rebecca Titler, who invited us to collaborate with the Loyola Sustainability Research Center and Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability to bring you sustainability and the pandemic, environmental degradation and the pandemic, today's event. Thanks so much for being here. We at ForSpace are very pleased to facilitate the fruitful conversations that emerge when you give time and you give space and reflection to issues that affect us all. So to that end, we're super pleased to take part in today's proceedings. And speaking of proceedings, just a few notes. This event is being recorded and will be available on our website early next week, concordia.ca/4. We are simultaneously live streaming to Facebook. All of you out there, hello. If you have comments, comment below the video and we'll make sure to relay them here. If you're attending the webinar proper and settled in now for this great discussion that's about to take place, we invite you to use the chat for any comments that you'd like to make throughout and kind of conversation that might arise as you listen to our speakers. But if you have specific questions that you'd like the moderator to address during the moderated question period, we'd suggest that you use the Q&A proper so it's easier for us to discern. That would be great and helpful. So thank you very much. So without further ado, it's now my pleasure to pass things over to Jim Grant. Over to you, Jim.
Great, thank you, Anna. Anna's done such a great job introducing us that I have very little to do. So I'm here just to represent the Loyola Sustainability Research Center. We have two great speakers lined up today, and I'll introduce the first speaker now, and then I think I'll turn it over to Rebecca. She will be running the show, but our first speaker is Dr. Emma Despland. She's my colleague in the Department of Biology at Concordia, and she's also a member of the Loyola Sustainability Research Center. Emma's an insect ecologist, among other things, and she's going to talk today about how humans have facilitated the transfer of these diseases, including COVID, from other animal populations to humans. So Rebecca, Rebecca will moderate. Do you want to come on to say anything now, Rebecca, or just keep us in line? Okay, she's good. So go ahead, Emma. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jim. I wanted to start here with just some headlines about this relationship between the destruction of nature and pandemics, and maybe point out that the first one here from mid-March, I don't know if people remember what it was like way back in mid-March, posed this as a question: is destruction of nature responsible for COVID-19? And then as the summer gets along, it's no longer a question, it's an affirmation. So pandemics result from destruction of nature, say UN and WHO. Rampant destruction of forests will unleash more pandemics. So it's gone from being a question to being a clear fact. And that's in part because of some of the other publications listed here. So the United Nations report and this study in Nature. Okay, so what we're going to look at today a little bit is quite how that relationship works. So I guess the first question is looking at zoonotic diseases. So zoonotic diseases are diseases that come from an animal to a human being. And 2/3 of all known human infectious diseases are in some way or other of zoonotic origin. And so this includes diseases that have been known as human diseases for a very long time. So things like rabies, the plague, measles, smallpox, diphtheria, all had been animal diseases in the past, and sometime in the very distant past had transferred to human populations. However, there are also new zoonotic diseases that have emerged relatively recently. So within my lifetime, the first really big one that became a global pandemic and that's still ongoing is HIV/AIDS, for which I think, as people know, there is still no vaccine. Since then, there has also been SARS, MERS, Ebola. There have been multiple outbreaks of Ebola. I've only listed some of them here. The first known one was 1976, and the really big one was the 2013, 2015, and there are still smaller outbreaks of Ebola going on now. So that's by no means over. Swine flu, H1N1, which was responsible for the great 1918 pandemic, but there have also been multiple other outbreaks since then, including one that I caught myself, bird flu, H5N1, and now COVID-19. Now, maybe it's just worth pointing out, these are not all coronaviruses. So these three are coronaviruses, and the others are other types of viruses that have also come from animals to people. Okay, I would just like to mention in passing that these are the two people whom we really have to thank the most, probably, for the fact that Ebola was contained in Africa and did not become a global pandemic. So Dr. Khan was the first person who diagnosed Ebola correctly, raised the global alarm that there's something big and important going on here, and importantly also took samples so that they could be sequenced so we could learn more about that disease. Dr. Adadevo was the person who stopped Ebola from getting rampant in Nigeria, and despite a lot of political pressure, quarantined some very sort of prominent people who had Ebola and who did subsequently die. But preventing Ebola from going widespread in Nigeria was a really big deal because Nigeria is a very large interconnected country, and if it had been in Nigeria, it would have been everywhere. Okay, so I'm sure people have realized, I've heard a lot in the media, the story about bats and the links between bats and COVID-19. So this was first understood when there was a SARS outbreak in 2004, and antibodies to SARS were found in 3 individual horseshoe bats, suggesting that these bats had contracted SARS. Since then, there's been a team of Chinese researchers working on coronaviruses in bats, and have found hundreds and hundreds of different coronaviruses that infect bats. And dozens of those viruses are in the same group as SARS, so they're related to SARS, and they can infect human lung cells in a Petri dish. Now, for obvious reasons, nobody has tried to infect human lung cells in a human lung, but that suggests that there are dozens of other coronaviruses in bats that could potentially become human pathogens if the conditions were right. Interestingly, too, these Chinese researchers noticed that in some villages near these bat caves, about 3% of the inhabitants had antibodies to SARS, despite reporting that they'd never had SARS themselves, which suggests that there had been very small local effects of zoonotic transmission where people would have caught diseases from bats and just brushed it off as, a flu or something. But so that these transmissions were happening perhaps more often than we think. Okay, we now know that the SARS-CoV-2 virus, so a little bit of background, maybe people are familiar, just in the same way as HIV is a virus, but AIDS is a disease, SARS-CoV-2 is a virus, and the disease that it causes is COVID-19. So if we talk about SARS-CoV-2, the sequence of that virus is 96% identical to a virus that had been previously identified by that Chinese team in bats. So it's like people, 2 viruses that share a lot of DNA are closely related to each other. So SARS-CoV-2 is closely related to a virus that was found in bats 15 years ago. But 96% identical is not 100% identical, and it suggests about 10 years of separation, which suggests that the ancestor of SARS-CoV-2 had been in bats. It quite possibly passed through another animal host. We're not sure which one it was yet, and then it would have been transmitted from that other animal host to a human being. So that part we don't know. What we do know is that since then, thousands of individual SARS-CoV-2 genomes have been sequenced from patients around the world, and they all have a common ancestor. So it seems pretty clear that there was one animal to human event, and then that's been followed by sustained human to human transmission. So people passing it on to other people. Okay, so this is kind of a summary of what we know about the evolutionary history of coronaviruses that attack people. There are 3 coronaviruses that cause serious disease. So MERS, SARS-1 and SARS-CoV-2, so SARS-2 if you like. There are also, and those have all appeared relatively recently, and they've all come relatively recently from bats. So for example, MERS was jumped from a bat to a camel, has now become established as a camel disease. So it is now a disease that exists in camels in the Middle East. It's a veterinary disease, it's there. And it then jumped from camels to people. Now, fortunately, MERS, there is very little human to human transmission. So it is still a disease that exists. There still are, in hospitals in the Middle East, patients showing up with MERS, but they have caught it from camels, not from other people. SARS-CoV-2, I think so here we understand quite well, this virus was in a bat, it jumped from bats to civets and then from civets to people. And then there was, contrary to MERS here, there was a lot of human to human transmission. And so SARS had been transmitting throughout human beings for about 2 years. And then it was halted and there haven't been any cases since. SARS-CoV-2, the ancestor that we know of is in the bat. We suspect that there's an intermediate. We haven't found it yet. Then jump to there's this one event of human transmission, and then since then we've got a lot of human-to-human transmission of the disease occur. And then we have the rest of this graph here is like a family tree where we see the closest known relative to the bat ancestor of SARS-CoV-2 is another bat virus here, which only causes bat disease. So that would be like the sister virus. And then SARS-CoV-1 is kind of like a cousin virus. It's relatively closely related, but it's not the closest relative. And then if you go farther back, MERS is even farther related. And then there are also these 4 other coronaviruses that have been circulating in the human population for a very long time. And they cause minor respiratory disease. So catching one of these is like catching a common cold. Most of you have probably had one of these. And they've been circulating in the human population for so long, we don't even really know what the ancestral animal source was or when that original transmission occurred. But these ones are more closely related to viruses that we see in mice and rats rather than to viruses that occur in bats. Okay, so there's something special about bats and coronaviruses. Bats host unusually high numbers of viruses in general, and they also host very, very high numbers of coronaviruses, including some that can spill over to humans. And this is something that was never really studied in that, disease ecology of wild animals didn't really feel like a research priority. It is now. And so we understand that there's something really unique about the bat immune system that means that they tolerate more viruses than do most other mammals. And it's thought that this might be related to bats' capacity for flight, because that's also something that makes bats unique among mammals, that when they fly, their body temperature rises. This is kind of akin to having a fever, and that means that their immune system might function differently in a way that destroys viruses less than other mammals do. But it's worth noting that bats host a lot of these viruses, but they're often unaffected by them. So these bats that have multiple viruses, they're not all dead. So their immune system is effective in its own way in protecting them from disease. And that, as you can imagine, has become a very kind of hot area of research. Okay, so if we just look at quick kind of introduction to biodiversity science, how many bat species are in the world? I would have invited people to write an answer in the chat. I'm not sure if that's going to work, so I'll just invite you to guess. Think about it. And then the answer is essentially that there are about 5,000 species of mammals in the world. Half of them in here are rodents. So that's mice, rats, voles, lemmings, things like that. And of the remaining, half are bats. So a quarter of all mammal species are bats. And then all the other non-bat, non-rodent species are in this other corner here. If we look at biogeography, where are these bats? So here are another couple of questions, maybe encourage people to think, how many species of bats are there native to Quebec? And I have Vietnam there just as a kind of comparison. And the answer is essentially here that there are 8 species of bats that are native to Quebec. There are 64 in Vietnam. And this is classic of biogeography. And this is despite the fact that Vietnam is much, much smaller than Quebec, because it's a much hotter place and a much wetter place. These kind of wet tropical areas are where all the biodiversity is. If you look at the human populations, you can see that unfortunately also that's where all the people live. Hot tropical places have more biodiversity, they have more people. And if we look just specifically for bats, this is the map of bat density throughout the world. So the dark blue places have few species of bats. The light blue spaces like Vietnam here have kind of middling numbers of bats. But the real center of bat biodiversity, where most of those species here, is in tropical South America. Okay, so zoonotic spillovers are not a new thing. They've probably been happening since the dawn of time. And historians have suggested, if you look at the historical literature, there are all these events of plague where disease occurs, everybody in a city dies, and then it goes away. And it's not clear that those were all, the same disease agents. Some of them might have been novel zoonotic spillovers, and we'll never know. What we do know is that spillovers are accelerating dramatically now, and that this is linked to land use change and habitat destruction. And so that's why this paper in Nature has said that we are essentially creating risky landscapes. Okay, how does that work? Well, this goes back to a paper in Science that was published about 20 years ago, where they say that emerging infectious diseases, so these are new infectious diseases. And an infectious disease is a disease you catch from somebody else. So we're not talking about diabetes or heart disease or anything. We're talking about diseases that you can catch. Things that are contagious, that's the word. So they're saying that we're getting more new emerging infectious diseases because we're changing transmission pathways. And so they break diseases down into 3 categories. You have wildlife diseases, human diseases, and diseases of domesticated animals. And you can have new, say you can have new wildlife diseases coming from wildlife in one place to wildlife in another place. How? Through basically transport and travel. So for example, if people heard of white nose syndrome and that's decimating North American bats, that's a disease of European bats that European bats were able to kind of cope with. They got sick, they didn't all die. That disease got brought over to North America through increased transport and globalization. It's now wiping out North American bats. You can have the agricultural intensification. So with much higher densities of agricultural animals and constitutive use of antibiotics and very low hygiene conditions, you get new diseases arriving in livestock. So things like bird flu and swine flu. And we don't talk very much about these when they remain only veterinary diseases, but there have been outbreaks of diseases in things, especially chickens and pigs, that have remained veterinary diseases. They didn't skip to people, but they killed thousands and thousands of animals, with, of course, important financial consequences for the farmers. Human infectious diseases, you can have the same thing of novel diseases jumping from one human population to another through global travel. And the big obvious one there would be the outbreaks of smallpox that occurred in the Americas as they were brought from the European colonizers. Smallpox was a terrible disease that affected Europeans, but it didn't kill most people. When it arrived in the Americas, it did kill the majority of the population. So that was a novel disease that was brought through global travel. And of course, you can also have diseases jumping from wildlife to people. So that's things like, COVID-19. You can have and back from people to wildlife. You can have diseases jumping from livestock to people. So things like bird flu and swine flu, and going back the other way, which obviously we're less concerned about. And we can have diseases jumping from wildlife to livestock and back again. So one example would be brucellosis, which is a disease of cattle. And in the Canadian West, brucellosis has been jumping from cattle on ranches to bison and infecting and killing bison, which are already a protected species. So you've got all these new pathways of diseases jumping back and forth between populations. And in general, it's all linked to these new transmission pathways that are linked to human activity. Okay, so here's a paper that came out in Science this year where they look in detail at some of the mechanisms, where they say things like road building, mining camps, logging camps, expansion of urban centers, migration, war, monocultures of livestock and crops. All of these have led to increases in spillovers of viruses from animals to people. And then when you combine that with hunting, global transport, farming, the wildlife trade, so all of these are contacts between animal and people, you have much greater transmission of these novel diseases. One example of that, specifically with bats, is that bats tend to roost in caves or hollow trees. When all the hollow trees are cut down, bats then come to roost in abandoned buildings, in wells, in people's gardens, sheds. And as these bats are roosting in human settlements, diseases spill over much more likely from bats to people. So in general, they're concluding that deforestation increases contact between people and livestock and wildlife, and having them in closer contact increases the risk of disease between these 3 groups. Same paper then goes on to highlight the 3 main mechanisms that they see as the most important, I guess, causes of increased zoonotic diseases. The first one is habitat destruction. And they make an interesting point here where they say, in pure economic terms, if all you're concerned about is the money, the economic devastation caused by pandemics, it would be a major return on investment to keep forests intact. So we're not talking about all the other benefits forests bring to biodiversity, to climate regulation, to clean air, to clean water. If you just count, and you're not even counting, the human cost of pandemics, if you just look financially, how much money do forests save us by preventing pandemics? It makes it worth it to leave those forests in place rather than cut them down. So deforestation and habitat destruction in general is a really important factor there. The other one they mentioned is the wildlife trade. So this is when wild animals are hunted and then sold either, for food or traditional medicine, but also for pets and for leather and other kind of luxury goods. Much of this trade is illegal, but it's still happening. And they say that this really needs to be curtailed and much better managed. But they do mention the point that it also has to be curtailed and managed in a way that respects Indigenous access to wildlife and local Indigenous use of wildlife, because that's been shown that when local Indigenous communities manage their own wildlife, yes, they harvest it, but they tend to protect the habitat. And that's a completely different phenomenon from international trade. And that's something we could maybe discuss. And then finally, the third one is biosafety, that intensive agriculture with overcrowding of farm animals in very unhygienic conditions and using antibiotics in a preventative way, so you give them antibiotics before they get sick, is promoting the emergence of new diseases. And when you have more new emergence diseases in farm animals, well, farm animals are tended by farmers, and those diseases are likely to skip. So these are really the three main factors that those authors identify as practices that are recipes for disaster, really, in terms of pandemic. And one point that I find interesting is that people have been talking about this at least since SARS. Some people have been talking about it since AIDS. That's early 1980s. So this is not a new thing. But yet, of course, when the next big pandemic hasn't happened yet, it doesn't necessarily feel quite as urgent as it should. Okay, so the notion of ecosystem services, I'm not sure if this is one that's familiar to people. So it's trying to kind of bring the idea of nature and ecology together with economics. So in economics, goods and services are things that people buy and sell. Ecosystem services are things that nature does for us for free, that we don't pay nature for. And the idea is that we should perhaps put a dollar value on these things instead of just considering them as for free, things that are out there. So there are obvious services like food, clean drinking water, regulation of air quality, climate regulation, all things that are obviously important and necessary for human survival. But the one that's relevant to us here is the one down here of disease and pest regulation. So one thing that healthy ecosystems do for us is regulate diseases. And as we are breaking down those healthy ecosystems, we are getting more diseases. So I don't know if the Anthropocene is a term that's familiar to people. It's the idea that we are now in a geological epoch where humans are the primary cause of permanent planetary change. So if you look at the major functions of the planet, the way the planet operates, questions like, what is covering the land mass, the chemistry of the oceans, the global cycles of carbon, nitrogen, and so on, the main factor that's influencing these major functions of the planet is human beings. And so that's basically what the word Anthropocene means. And the Living Planet report, which just came out this year, is a report kind of quantifying human effects on various aspects of the planet. And I'm not going to go into the details. There's a lot of really discouraging numbers. But the main one here is the one that's in italics, where they conclude that urgent and immediate action is necessary in the food and agricultural sector. All the indicators of biodiversity loss are heading in the wrong way rapidly. And as a first step, what we really need is to get deforestation out of our supply chain. And that's absolutely vital. Another report that people might have heard of is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So I think everybody's heard of the IPPC, the Intergovernmental Platform on Climate Change. This was a similar platform looking at biodiversity and ecosystem services. And what they point out that I think is really important is not only that biodiversity is in danger, but that means that the services that we get from ecosystems are in danger. And that negative trends in biodiversity, so destruction of nature, is making it impossible for us to meet the Sustainable Development Goals for human populations. So all the Sustainable Development Goals are things like decreasing hunger, decreasing poverty, getting more children into education, improving global health. All of these things are now being put in damage by the way we're destroying nature. So it's the dichotomy between protect nature or protect human beings isn't true anymore. That the way that we're destroying nature is actually harming human beings. The way they sum it up is to say that the essential interconnected web of life on Earth is getting smaller and increasingly frayed. And one consequence of the way that this web of life is getting frayed is that new diseases are slipping through. And COVID-19 is one of those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. I learned a lot. I'll see if anybody has any questions. You can put them either in the chat or the Q&A. Sometimes it takes people a couple of minutes to type. So if anybody on the panel currently has any questions, I'll take those first. Emma, do you want to maybe stop sharing your screen so that we can see the panel?
No, you're for sure.
We can see each other. Okay, perfect.
Chat, but, yeah.
Wonderful. Jim, go ahead.
Sure. So Emma, Brazil will be the real danger spot for future pandemics with all their bat biodiversity and forests just starting to be really destroyed?
If we're worried about bat diseases, probably. If they're pig or chicken diseases, it might be somewhere else. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. But you know, but Brazil is certainly a place to look at and to be concerned about. Yeah.
Great talk. Thank you.
No, thank you.
I have a kind of a follow-up question to that. Is it the bat biodiversity that matters, so the number of species, or is it bat abundances that matter? I know they're probably correlated.
I'm not sure we know. And I know there has been this study of coronaviruses in bats in China. I don't know if, you know, South American species of bats harbor as many coronaviruses. I'm not sure anybody knows. I mean, in China, they put a lot of research effort into this following SARS, because they realized like SARS was bad, but it could have been worse. And so they did start preparing, but I don't know. So I think there's bat biodiversity, there's bat abundance, there's bat ability to harbor viruses, and there's the bat-human connection.
Right. Thank you. Okay, I have another question in the chat, which is, are disease vectors associated in the discussion of zoonotic diseases?
Yeah, okay, so a disease vector is, maybe a good example would be the plague. So the plague is a disease that affects rodents, and it's vectored by fleas. So this life cycle of the plague is that it affects a rodent, the rodent gets bitten by a flea, the flea then carries the plague to another rodent. So the flea gets called the vector because you cannot catch the plague unless you're bitten by a flea. But the plague becomes zoonotic when a flea that bit a rodent that had the plague then goes on to bite another person instead. So there actually was a man in the United States who caught the plague relatively recently, a few years ago. And it turns out he'd been hiking in Arizona, I think, and where there are prairie dogs that have the plague. And a flea had jumped from a prairie dog to his dog, and then from his dog to him. So vectoring and zoonotic is not quite the same. I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah, I think so. I have another question, which is, how long do these pandemics usually last? We can look at your slide.
Yeah, so it has to, so I guess the cycle of a disease there are a number of different things. There's how lethal it is. So something like Ebola kills like 70% of people who are infected. So a disease like that usually doesn't last very long because in a short period of time, lots of people get infected, lots of them die, and those who don't die escape, and the disease basically runs itself out. Something like AIDS has been going for 30 years now, in part because it's possible to be asymptomatic and to keep on transmitting the disease before you are dead. Whereas with Ebola, you usually die within days. So it depends on the virulence, how likely the disease is to kill you and how fast it kills you, the mode of transmission, how likely human-to-human transmission is. So with mares, we're quite lucky in that it doesn't human-to-human transmit. It's just individual people who catch it from camels. So I'm not sure we can really, I mean, people make the connection between COVID-19 and the flu pandemic, but it's not exactly the same disease. And we don't have the same level of global travel as we did now than we did then. So I'm not sure I can answer that.
All right, you don't have a crystal ball. I'll take one more question for Emma, and then we'll move on to Liz's presentation, just so that we make sure she has enough time, and then we can come back for general discussion after Liz's presentation. So if you do have more questions for Emma, hold on to them. But I'll take Arun's question, which is there a level of species specificity of these diseases to each bat or other animal vector species, or are they mostly generalists?
That's a very good question, and I'm afraid I don't know.
Arun, what are you doing for your PhD?
That's a good answer, question. Yeah. I'm not sure anybody does know, but I certainly don't.
All right, thank you very much, Emma. With that, Jim, I'll let you introduce Liz, and we'll move on. But again, if you do have questions for Emma, do hang on to them.
Great. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Rebecca. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Elizabeth Miller, who is a documentary filmmaker and a member of the Department of Communication Studies here at Concordia. She's also a member of the Research Center, and Professor Miller will talk about issues of the pandemic and waste, and she might even show us a film, I'm guessing. So Liz, please take it away.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you, Emma, for such an informative presentation. If we had more time, I could imagine like we could work with each other and I could sort of chart the potential communication campaigns we need to, you know, reforest, stop the deforestation and, you know, really respond to some of these critical issues. But that's not what I'm going to present today. I thought that I would talk a little bit about waste and some of the ways that waste was exhibited during COVID and some of the new waste patterns that I sort of have been witnessing. I'm going to share my screen. And can you see this? Okay, great. So COVID coincided for me with the planning of a new course that I would be teaching. It was deemed as a wicked course, and it was supposed to be interdisciplinary, just like the beauty of this particular research center in interdisciplinary presentations. And it was a 7-day intensive cycling course. This is what we proposed to waste sites throughout the city. The course was structured around city bike tours that MJ Thompson, who was my collaborator, associate dean, writer, and scholar, MJ Thompson, and I designed for our students. And the students were also asked to choose a site, visit it repeatedly, and to propose solutions from this immersive experience on the topic of waste in Montreal. So it was actually just chance that this course would take place during the summer in the middle of COVID. But the objective of the course was to be a part of this moment in time in promoting zero waste and challenging the way waste is both communicated and managed in our lives. So COVID offered us this very unique opportunity to get out on our bikes. It was actually, for me, a saving grace, a mental, one of the ways that I got through COVID was spending a lot of time on my bike, but also to re-examine the waste around us. My own entry, as I've said, to the theme of pandemic and waste really stems from the communication lens. So how are communication campaigns and behaviors connected? And what, for me in particular, is the role of documentary projects in helping to make us aware of and even hopefully shift individual, cultural, and industrial practices. So what do I mean when I'm talking about waste? Well, obviously there are many kinds of waste: sewage, industrial, agriculture, construction, mining, nuclear, medical waste, something that many of us have been tuned into recently, and electronic waste. I think we're going to see a whole aftermath of electronic waste in 10 years from all the activities that we're doing online at this moment. But for many of us, the most visible form of waste is household waste or municipal solid waste. And this is the waste that we as individuals manage every day. During COVID, we saw a rise in the waste we produce at home. Of course, we were spending so much time at home. There was a rise in home renos, online shopping, takeout, and in the use and circulation of disposable products like masks, latex gloves, food containers. And much of the rise in disposables has been connected to concerns about safety. Very critical, but it's complicated. How do we balance the need to consider the health of our bodies with the health of our planet? And the majority of these single-use disposable products are made with plastic, a material whose lifespan is indefinite, as many of us know. So Indigenous scholar Max Liboiron talks about the irony of the fact that the shortest life commodity is made of the longest life material. And she explains, of course, certain plastics might be life-saving, but we may not be using these plastics well. She explains, and many of us know, that a plastic bag can last anywhere between 100 and 20,000 years, because when plastics are fragmented, the molecular bond does not really ever break down. And she rejects any kinds of false notions that we can simply extract plastic from our lives. She speaks to plastic as kin, something our lives are now forever enmeshed with, which makes dealing with the plastic even more complicated. So the rise in disposables in the first stage of COVID felt like a real step backwards, because in the last decade, we've witnessed a very powerful global communications campaign around zero waste. There's been a massive cultural awakening about the consequences of plastic and packaging on our planet, in the ocean, on our plates. I decided not to show you any of those awful images because you've seen them. And this has in turn impacted policies. So just back to the course, we taught the Wastegapes course using the framework of what is called discard studies. And discard studies encourages us to look beyond what we immediately see in front of us, the waste in our homes, and instead look at chains of production and consider the people impacted at each stage of production, the workers who are engaged in the production, the residents who live near industrial sites, and the policies that are in place to manage waste. And so often we're looking at the disposal, but we're not actually thinking about waste in terms of extraction as well. And this is a still from a film that I've been talking about quite a bit, The Story of Plastics, that came out in the middle of COVID. It was directed by the producers of The Story of Stuff. And the film does the very important work at looking at the chains of production, helping to shift our gaze from disposal to extraction, and making a very important connection between the production of petroleum and the production of plastics. And as I've mentioned, what I follow is the communication campaigns behind all of this. And one of the points clearly articulated in the film is we had to learn how to waste in the way that we do today. And the fossil fuel companies were very clever in investing millions of dollars in communication campaigns that would effectively shift the responsibility from corporations to the consumers. So the efforts to rebrand plastic date back to 1956, and these are just a few images of some pivotal campaigns from the 70s to the present. I grew up with the Give a Hoot, Don't Pollute, the use of wildlife to make us feel badly. This was all part of the Keep American Beautiful campaign, where nonprofits and the corporations were all messily involved with. And of course, the more contemporary campaigns where we see children around the world sorting plastic trash towards recycling efforts, which we are slowly coming to understand are not feasible. They're almost impossible. Insiders from the plastics industry have known from the very get-go that plastics do not recycle. They never have, and they never will. And they're with us. And this is just a brilliant example of a very effective communication campaign, the labeling of plastic, so that you look at your plastic bottle and think, oh, which kind of plastic is it? But there's a complete disconnect between this campaign and the actual industry of recycling plastic, which, as I'll say again, really does not exist. So the labeling and all of these campaigns have really been encouraging consumers to engage in a form of busyness, the busyness of sorting, rather than the rethinking of the actual problem, the overproduction of plastic. And this is just an image, also an image still from the film, The Story of Plastic, that demonstrates how successful these campaigns have been. We produce and consume 400 million metric tons per year, and the plastic industry hopes that this will continue to expand as they export disposables all over the world. The target area right now, as many of you may know, is Africa. And just to reemphasize, the idea again is that these campaigns have diverted our attention away from holding the producers of plastic accountable for the end life of the product. Samantha McBride, in her book Recycling Reconsidered, calls this diversion busyness. And she suggests, like the film, that we look at the source. Waste experts use the metaphor of the toilet. If your toilet is flooding, do you attempt to mop up an endless flow, or do you try to turn off the tap? So we're all trying to learn how to message around this wicked complex problem. But let me get back to COVID. So during the first several months of lockdown, transportation, as we know, came to a standstill. And these are images that were circulating by amateur photographers around the world, who were mapping what this phenomena that we hadn't seen before. Prior to the pandemic, oil demand was about 100 million barrels a day, but during the pandemic, that demand fell to about $30 million a day. And we even saw a moment when oil prices hit sub-zero. And this resulted in what oil economists call a demand shock. The image of tankers waiting in ports around the world was predominant as the cost of a barrel of oil dropped into the negatives. Producers actually had to pay money to manage the excess oil, to get rid of it. And oil experts such as Clifford Cross and Daniel Yergin have suggested that the collapse of oil prices are a reminder that fossil fuels are simply too volatile to be the basis of any resilient economy. Which takes me to this moment in time in what many communication experts are calling a plastic war. This is also the title of an upcoming documentary about the battle between the global anti-plastic movement and the expanding plastics industry. On the one side is the industrial ruling class, an industry that is growing exponentially because of the low cost of natural gas through fracking. Billions of dollars are being invested in new plastic plants as we speak, and the US is now one of the world's largest plastic producers. Some estimate that if unchecked, the plastic industry will actually triple by 2050. And the fossil fuel industry are rightfully worried. Not only did profits plunge during the coronavirus, but on the other side of this war or communication campaign is a growing global movement of informed citizens who are increasingly empowered by information campaigns. Break Free from Plastic Movement was founded in 2015, and it involves 1,500 organizations. Companies operate on a global scale. Our movements also need to operate on a global scale. Let me go back to Canada. Many of us were inspired this week by the announcement of our government's plan to ban single-use plastics and to aspire to zero plastic waste by 2030. This also means holding the producers of plastic more accountable for the end-of-life plastic products. Groups like the Ivy Foundation are investing time proposing ideas for a green recovery from COVID, and we need to put energy into communication around these proposals. In Montreal, the city has a zero waste plan in place, and Valérie Plante is gaining global recognition with her plan to make Montreal a zero waste city. In my own neighborhood, leaders like Marianne Guiguière, who is also in charge of transportation, she is spearheading plans like Réseau Express, which is to move cycling beyond simply recreation, but into a viable four-season transportation system. Many of us have had the unique opportunity to already make use of some of these new routes that were foregrounded during COVID. We have organizations such as the Québec Association of Zero Waste, and they are running incredibly innovative events such as workshops for students and faculties. They are running their Zero Waste Festival this October 30th. And even though there was a slight lull in stores, zero waste stores, as we kind of wondered and worried ourselves through the first months of COVID in sanitation issues, the number of zero waste stores continue to be on the rise. Since 2016, 23 vrac stores have opened up in Montreal. And I can report that a new vrac store in my neighborhood opened 2 days ago. At Concordia, we're seeing the momentum with waste leaders like Fezel of the Zero Waste Program. We're launching our Concordia Sustainability Action Plan that so many of us at the Research Center have been involved in. And there's a real convergence of innovation from students, faculty, and staff. These are things to be hopeful for, which brings me back to the waste class. The special ingredient for the class was the idea of the larger challenge, of course, of addressing environmental degradation in the pandemic is, I think the special ingredient is collaboration, interdisciplinary research, interdisciplinary conversations, and interdisciplinary collaborations. For the class, we had the opportunity to work with staff, faculty, students, and elected officials, community experts, to really think about how we can recalibrate our relationship to waste during COVID and beyond. And I just wanted to quickly highlight two of the communication campaigns that students came up with. One was about water quality in the port, and the other is a phone app for people to find out where to take your waste, but importantly, where that waste goes after you dump it. And then I just wanted to show a very short clip of one of the students, and I'm going to actually just have to stop sharing for a second and start again. Yep, it's all good. Okay. Let's see if I can do. There we go. Okay.
I took a class at Concordia University in the summer of 2020. The name of the class had intrigued me, Wastescapes. We got to choose our site to visit for the week, and I picked the Champ des Possibles, also known as the Field of Possibilities. These images you see right now are all the things I saw on the first walk over there, before my phone died. I chose to walk the Wednesday bike tour. I screenshotted all my walking directions and headed first to Champ. The Canadian Pacific Railway used this space, located in the Mile End district of Montreal, Quebec, as a marshalling yard until the end of the 80s. Local community eventually took over managing this urban wasteland, nursing it to a green space in the middle of the city, home to over 300 plant and animal species. I definitely heard a tension between the nature and the city. This made me think about sound waste. The symphony of capitalism's cogs rubbing up against each other, drowning out nature's hums that truly soothe. The nice thing was the deeper you went into Champ des Possibles, the more nature sang, louder. It was while walking along the side of the train tracks that I saw a dead bird stuck in some junk barbed wire. I saluted the bird and kept walking. I was hoping I would see a train, and I was happy when I did. It was louder than I thought it would be. I can't quite remember the last time I was this close to a train. I got to the Electra bag when it was closed, but I still got to explore the third floor, including this interesting hole in the wall. And this graffiti. Eco Center, incinerator, attended Zoom class while en route, and made it to Space Park before sundown. Biodiversity is extremely important, and I'm happy that this green space has some room to breathe. But I can't help but wonder what the space would have looked like if it had never been disturbed in the first place. What biodiversity has already been wasted, never to come back again?
Okay, so just the wisdom of our students and the inspiration that they so often can provide us. And, you know, again, just to reemphasize the importance of the Loyola Sustainability Research Center and our ability to sort of really thrive from this kind of interdisciplinary research conversation. And like I was saying before, I sort of wish I had rejigged this presentation to really think about the communications campaign that we need to respond to COVID. But that's for the next year.
Thank you so much, Liz. And yeah, maybe we can work on that for next time. That would be great. I have a question right away in the Q&A. Questions for both professors, Despland and Miller. If there was one message you could relay to the public about the relationship between COVID-19 and the environment or waste, what would it be? Good question. Who wants to go first? Liz, you want to go first?
Well, I mean, I think I was really moved by the report that Emma was citing and the very obvious message that we need to protect these life-sustaining resources and that we're expending them in like exhaustive, horrifying measures. And, you know, I think the waste experts and scientists that I was speaking to were all trying to find language, you know. The toilet spilling is a really good one. It's like, are we just going to keep like moving the shit all over the floor, or are we actually going to turn the tap and rethink the way we are? And I think for many people, COVID was a very deep philosophical moment to come to terms with the speed in which we manage our lives, with the wasteful forms in which we live. And I think for many of us, it was a really beautiful moment to focus on the very local and kind of just appreciate the very basic in our lives. Of course, I worry a bit about all this electronic worlding that we're doing, the consequences here. But I think that there was something very deeply philosophical about what we are going through. And I think we need to sit with it. And so, you know, really rethinking the flow and the tap of all the waste in our lives, the forests that we need to protect, and how to be really creative about doing that, and how I need to continue working with Jim and Emma and biologists so that, you know, all the work that we're doing is just reinforced by the knowledge of each other. This is a moment where we really need interdisciplinary efforts.
Emma, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think I'd maybe, this is kind of serendipitous because I think the answer is maybe in Hope Yaren's book called The Story of More, which I'm presenting in the Friday read next week. I think Anna probably has better details about that. But she basically documents how consumption in the developed OECD countries has gone up by a huge amount in the last generation, without necessarily much increase in, you know, any meaningful measures of quality of life. Mm. And it's this huge overconsumption that people in OECD countries, so like us, that's at the basis of, you know, habitat destruction, climate change, generation of waste, intense agriculture. And of course, this overconsumption is by a small minority of the human population, right? So it's by no means everybody. And what she puts forward as kind of a goal is that if everybody could consume at the level at which Swiss people consumed in 1965, that would be sustainable for everybody on the planet. And I don't know the math. I mean, she did that calculation, but then she goes on to say that, you know, Switzerland in 1965 was not a bad place. You know, people had enough to eat and so on. And yeah, it is this kind of huge and unnecessary overconsumption of everything.
Thank you. One of my students at the beginning of the pandemic wrote that Mother Nature has sent us to our rooms to think about what we've done and reflect. You've obviously all been reflecting. I have a few more questions, which is one of them is, sorry, my son is dealing with the spotlights in the background. What should we do as individuals? Is there anything that we can do?
I mean, my feeling is really that the individual moment is the logic of capitalism, and that it's really kind of collective solutions, and that we actually, especially in an academic context, have to learn to kind of bridge away from our comfort levels of working in an individual context and really kind of exercise our muscles in thinking together. But like, if it's what can we do tomorrow? I think so much of this is a bit kind of what Emma was moving towards, is like really valuing slowness, really valuing less consumption, really thinking about how we can hold some of these transnationals accountable. And I do almost see this as both a communications war as well as just an ongoing need to educate ourselves, but also really like speak out about the loopholes. I mean, there's a huge election coming up in the United States, and I call it the fossil fuel election. You know, it's just so obvious, you know, when I listen to the debates about like really what's at the center of this. And so much of that is about consumption and profit. So I think, you know, really like valuing the simplicity of our lives and relying on each other are two things that we really need to get better at.
Thank you, Liz. Emma, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think one often puts a lot of emphasis on things that individuals can do in terms of changing their own lifestyle, of, you know, driving less and flying less and eating less meat and reusing. And I think there's a real limit to how useful that can be, because I've been doing most of that stuff since I was about 15, and, you know, it hasn't worked yet. So, and I think Liz kind of touched on this too, that a lot of it passes through collective action, and collective action at some level means politics. And that's either, you know, at the level of Montreal or the level of Quebec or the level of Canada. But I mean, Canada is a fossil fuel producing country. And fossil fuels are very deeply ingrained in our economy at so many levels. I mean, we use them to heat our houses. Anybody who has an RRSP, it's got fossil fuels in it. It funds our healthcare. So I think at some level, you know, doing your own little things is great, and it could be a good first step, and I'm not going to be disparaging that. But ultimately, there's collective action too. And it's not just in other countries. You know, we've got our own issues here as well. And whether you want to work locally in Montreal or, you know, at the level of Canada. But I think getting involved collectively and making your voice heard is important.
Yep. Thanks so much. I have another question for Liz from Carly. She says, great talk, and the glimpse of the Champ des Possibles was a lovely way to end a Friday, one of my favorite places in Montreal. My question for both of you is about how we communicate these immense challenges of waste while also preserving some hope. I think many people, understandably, are extremely discouraged to hear things like plastic isn't actually recycled after trying to do a good thing, recycle, for so long. How do we preserve people wanting to do the right thing when even the perceived right thing is often not nearly enough?
Well, I think for me, I mean, one of the ways that we framed the waste class was around two concepts in communication strategies. The first is the challenge. People, you know, want to feel that they're moving towards something. So even if it's like 7-day challenge to reach out to your local politician, or, you know, doing things that are collective, but that also you have a sense that it builds momentum. So challenges are really successful in communication campaigns, like posing a challenge to the university, to your department, to your school. But the other, you've actually named it, Carly, which is hope. Like, nobody really wants to join a pessimist. It's like we have to, I mean, we are hardwired towards hope. We are facing some of the most complex, depressing issues of our time, and we would all probably lay over and give up if we actually grappled with the immensity of what's in front of us. But, you know, doses of hope get us through the day. And so I think, like, though, you know, creativity, hope, I think that's why I showed that last video. It's just, it's so beautiful. It's poetic, poetry, aesthetics, hope, challenges. I mean, those are a few things in my grab bag. And I'll say it again, collaboration. Because I just think that it's really kind of, it makes all of this a bit easier when you feel like you're not alone. And we literally cannot do it alone. We have been sort of schooled in this idea of the neoliberal subject, the individual, but it's really, it's not working, and it doesn't connect us to the planet and the very resources that we need to continue to survive. So I also think, you know, falling in love with nature, which Carly, I know this is like a big part of what you're doing. I just want to sort of shout out to that unbelievably beautiful project you did this summer, where you got neighbors and people around Montreal measuring their trees. So citizen science projects, you know, where people are learning as have this unique opportunity to learn about the environment around themselves. So they're not just encountering the problem, but they are quickly becoming part of the solution. So your own initiatives in encouraging students to lead citizen science is just like, for me, that's as good as it gets.
Emma, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think there's maybe something I'd read here about the American civil rights movement, where they had studied between activists who persevered and those who gave up. And the ones who persevered, despite the, you know, being spat on and beaten up and arrested and so on, were, the main difference was community. So people who had strong friendships with other people in the movement, who were regularly communicating with these people, with their friends, with other activists. A lot of it went through the churches, which, you know, was that context there. It's not necessarily universal. So people who every Sunday heard the same message and were with like-minded people, that's what gave them hope. But somebody who came in isolated, even if they might have had the same ideals and the same motivation, was more likely to get discouraged and to give up. So it seems that community with like-minded people and sharing, whether it's through music or whatever rituals.
Joy.
Joy. And community and friendship.
Thanks to both of you. I have another question, which is from Christine White. I was impressed at the speed with which society changed practically overnight to protect one another from COVID-19 with safety measures. How do policymakers decide on the timeline to integrate new procedures, like Montreal being zero waste by 2030? Can't remember the exact year. It was 2030.
You know, I mean, COVID was so unbelievable on so many fronts in terms of seeing things that people have been talking about, thinking about for years. Like this whole idea that we would stop flying for 6 months, or proposals, like economic proposals that were coming out, were really, that was pretty exciting. I think, you know, what I understand is that politicians cannot act without the pressure of citizens. And so they need really the backbone of citizen movements. Universities are powerful figures. They need us to ask for things. Like they can't really, you know, come up with a timeline without an active citizen base saying, we believe in this, we want this, we support this. So it's a great question about how the city of Montreal actually came up with its own zero waste timeline. But I know that, like, you know, the more basic question is us really reinforcing, demanding. I mean, maybe that feels like a long timeline, as I think you're suggesting, like, and how quickly we were able to do some things. How come we can't, you know, force it even quicker? But it is a sort of very complex negotiation with, you know, what's considered economic health versus environmental health. And it doesn't have to be seen as the versus, of course.
Right. Thank you, Liz. Emma, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think I might maybe say part of that timeline is probably technical. So it's discussed with waste disposal experts and recycling experts and composting experts in terms of what's possible. And I have no expertise in that field, but I know people who do, and it actually is, you know, there's a lot of knowledge there. You can't just overnight transform a waste incinerator into, you know, a composting plant. But I think the point that's important that I think people might have more impact on, I think, is similar to what Liz is saying, is that in a democracy, politicians are very sensitive to how they think the people will respond. and anything that it looks like it. And so they'll be kind of wary of doing anything that they think might displease people. So the more they hear pressure from citizens that, yes, this is what we want you to do, the more they have people coming to, city council meetings or writing them letters or signing petitions, the more they feel, yes, the population is behind us and this is what we got to do.
Right.
So I think that participating in the democracy is, it might feel kind of like it's not taking you anywhere, but it is having an impact.
Yep. All right, I just looked at the time and it's 4:35, so we've already gone 5 minutes over. So I apologize. I'm going to take one more question though to end with, and then both Liz and Emma are faculty members at Concordia University. So if you want to contact them, you can find their email address, sorry guys, on the Concordia website. You can also contact me at any time. If you registered for this event, then you have my contact information. So I'm going to take the last question from Jochen Jaeger. Should we take advantage of the possibilities open now because of our Mayor Valerie Plante, for some collective action? What could that include, since this seems like a window of opportunity?
I think we need to leave this as an open question for every viewer. And I think we need to answer this question collectively as a university, as a research center. It's a very important time, and there is an opening. There is a lot at stake.
Yeah. Emma? Oh,
I think we can leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay.
Good answer.
All right. Well, thank you both for this inspiring, in the end, Friday afternoon. It's been a really eye-opening and fascinating discussion. So I really appreciate both of your participation. And all of you who came and who had great questions. I am so sorry that I did not get to all of them. But it is Friday afternoon and people have other places they need to be. So thank you all for participating. We will have another, the second in our monthly series, in our monthly webinar series on sustainability in the pandemic. Next month, we will have Katya Neves from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and Andrea Tremblay, who is actually a master's student of Liz Miller's. And they will both be speaking about the role of gardens and gardening in a pandemic and post-pandemic world. So we do hope that you'll come back next month. That's November 13th from 3:30 to 4:30. The posting is already up on the Fourth Space page and on the Loyola Sustainability Research Center page and on the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability. So hopefully we will see you then, and I will send out postings about that as well to remind you if you got a posting about this one. Thank you to Jim also for supporting this and for being involved, and to the Fourth Space for the wonderful, wonderful support. And I'll pass it along to you, Anna.
I know it's the start of the long weekend and it's Friday afternoon, but I really could have sat here a few more hours and kept going with this one. It was really just, you're seeing the feedback coming into the chat now. People really appreciated your insights, and I think there's such important conversations. So Rebecca, thank you for bringing this our way as well. Liz and Emma, your research, your insights are so crucial right now. It would be great to workshop these questions further, build some momentum for that collective action. We'll see what we can work on together. Jim, thank you as well for your participation, Rebecca, for your organization. Just reminding everybody very quickly that we've recorded this event. It will be available on our website, concordia.ca/4, probably by early next week. So check it out there if you want to reflect on some of the things that were mentioned, review those PowerPoints. Once again, there was a lot of information that was super interesting, and I know it's hard to process everything all at once. So thank you for making all of that available to us, to you both. Thank you to both panelists. On that note, I guess I do have to say goodbye, and thanks once again. I put a little survey in the chat. We hope that you'll click on that. I'll put it in again now. It will give us and our collaborators some helpful feedback, and you can leave comments for the panelists there as well, as we'll relay them to them. We'll relay the comments to the panelists. Okay, it has been a long week. Thanks everybody. On that note, have a great weekend and see you soon. Thanks.
Good job.